This is the United States Energy Association Power Sector Podcast, sponsored by global energy law firm Bracewell LLP. I'm Herman K. Trabish. I've covered the power sector since 2006, and I currently report for Utility Dive. In this episode of the USEA podcast, we're going to take our periodic look at policies driving the modernization of the U.S. grid, maybe the most crucial power sector challenge in 2 decades. Autumn Proudlove, Managing Director for Policy and Markets with the North Carolina Clean Energy Technology Center, or NCCETC, is going to describe the newest legislative and regulatory initiatives and trends to prepare the power system to integrate the full array of system resources. Autumn has helped lead NCCETC research and its 50 states quarterly energy policy updates at North Carolina State University for over 11 years. In that time, Autumn has formed as clear a perspective on the evolution of power sector regulation as any analyst anywhere. Autumn began her career in energy research for Aarhus University's Center for Energy Technologies and Vermont Law and Graduate School's Institute for Energy and the Environment. Welcome back, Autumn. Let's start with the beginning. What is grid modernization? How important is it? And how widespread are grid modernization efforts?
Herman, that is a big question for sure. I would say that there really is no standard agreed upon definition of grid modernization. It's generally seen as, making the grid more smart, making it automated, interactive, resilient, efficient. Um, and for the purposes of our reports where we're tracking grid modernization efforts, we take a pretty broad definition to grid modernization. So we're looking at technology deployment, but also things like policies, incentives, planning rules, rate design, all of these surrounding elements. And this is because technology and investments are influenced by policies, by their planning requirements, by utility business models, by for consumers, rate structures and incentives that they see. So we think it's necessary to really look at the full picture that's around grid modernization and these different elements that are driving it. Um, as far
There's a lot of this grid modernization activity, right?
Yeah, absolutely. There's so much to it, and it's really very widespread across the country. In our latest report for the first quarter of the year, 47 states plus DC and Puerto Rico all took actions related to grid modernization in some way. And this is actually after many years of doing this, we've refined the scope of our numbers a bit and actually have excluded bills that have been introduced but not yet passed the chamber. And we're still seeing almost every state across the country taking some type of action related to grid modernization.
362 policy and deployment actions taken in the first quarter, right?
Yeah, 362. So a lot is happening, and it's interesting because we see states at pretty different stages of grid modernization. There are lots of different types of activities, but some states are very active and maybe at more advanced stages of technology deployment and program design. And then you see some states that are maybe at more of an introductory stage and are installing things like advanced metering infrastructure or proposing a time of use rate option.
I get the impression that a lot of this activity, and it's growing all the time, is driven by the fact that there's more uh, compute capability. That's what the phrase the AI people use. But what it is artificial intelligence, machine learning. All of this is giving people more opportunities to modernize their grid. Do you think that's a correct impression?
I think it's definitely a piece of it. Technology is giving us more opportunity. And then I think on the other side, there's also a demand and expecting maybe more from our electricity system where we've wanted it to be safe, reliable, and affordable for a very long time. And now people are wanting greater resilience, especially in the face of more severe weather events and maybe integrating clean energy and distributed energy resources, having the chance to participate in the grid and own technologies themselves. So I think it's coming both from the technology availability side and from the consumer demand side.
So the big question, I mean, those really are the drivers, and they're all these drivers. But the big question these days is, has the federal policy, the new administration's policy, had an impact on the direction of grid modernization or what's being emphasized and not being emphasized? Have you seen any indicators? It's a little early. I think we have 100 days coming up this week or something. But um, uh, have you seen any impacts from federal policies?
There's definitely a lot of activity at the federal level in a different direction than we've seen for the last few years of
I can
obviously.
say that again.
But as far as what's happening at the state and utility level, we're still seeing a very high level of activity, pretty much consistent with past years. And as you said, it's only been a few months, so time will tell. But so far, it's been pretty consistent with what we've seen. I think some of that is states like to be drivers and what they're doing. A lot of these decisions are at the state and utility level. And I think another piece is grid modernization in particular. Some of these efforts have bipartisan support. There may be different rationales or reasons or objectives for doing them, but you might get to the same place with different reasons. Things like resilience and efficiency and saving money are pretty universal goals, and maybe a little bit less political, at least than the generation side of energy.
Mm. This might be a good time to just briefly pause and say that the U.S. regulatory and policy situation for the power system is very much focused on individual states' rights. I mean, each state has control of its own electric system, right? I'm not asking for a full hour lecture on regulatory policy, but in general, it's a very much focused on state decisions, right?
Yeah, in general, states have a lot of autonomy and a lot of decision-making authority over their electricity systems. You do have the influence of FERC, where there are
Federal
wholesale.
Energy Regulatory Commission.
Yep, yep. Where there are independent system operators, regional transmission organizations. So there can be another level in those regions of the country, but for the most part, most of these policies and decisions are being driven at the state level.
Mm. Okay, now a really big question in terms of really getting into grid modernization. What are the trend-setting grid modernization innovations that you're seeing around the country? Because we're talking about what's happening at the state level, there's different trends and different innovations happening in different parts of the country. Do you have favorites? We hear a lot about the need to meet data center demand. Are you seeing some states focus on that, especially around the DC area? What about deployment of battery energy storage? That's a big subject, and um, of course, there's some activity on EV public charging or for fleets. That requires regulatory action. And then we're hearing a lot about virtual power plants. So those are just, I'm mentioning a few things where there might be trends. What are you seeing?
Yeah, there is so many cool things going on, and it's very exciting to see everything that's happening across the country. I think one of the things that I am most interested and excited about has been the developments in virtual power plants. Um, I think it's interesting to see what you can do more on the demand and kind of grid edge side of things. And especially now with so many concerns and discussions around load growth, you want to look at all the pieces of the puzzle and what can you achieve with some load and demand flexibility. So we've seen a lot of new pilots and kind of full-fledged programs also being proposed by utilities lately. We just saw in Colorado, Excel Energy proposed a new program. Georgia Power proposed a new program. Arizona regulators approved one for Arizona Public Service. So a very active space. We're also seeing some states start to set statewide frameworks for virtual power plants rather than it solely being kind of a utility driven and utility by utility program process.
Mm,
And even within VPPs, a lot of these have been kind of battery storage focused, or you have more kind of traditional demand response programs. Increasingly, we're starting to see some of these programs become a bit more holistic and include multiple different types of distributed technologies. So Colorado's program, that would be an example of that. So it's interesting to me to see more holistic program design and looking at the system and trying to find opportunities rather than being so segmented by technology. So
Yeah.
definitely virtual power plants is up there. I think there's also a lot of interesting stuff happening with grid enhancing technologies. A lot of legislation this first quarter of the year has been states trying to get utilities to incorporate GETs into their planning processes or encouraging them to make investments. New Mexico had an interesting bill that requires utilities to file advanced grid technology plans and require consideration of these technologies within their IRPs. So seeing some kind of go,
Excuse me. I want to interrupt you. I apologize for interrupting, but
no
I think
problem.
it's important. We talked about virtual power plants. It's important that we, before we move on too quickly, make sure our listeners know what a virtual power plant is and why it's becoming more holistic. Uh, the idea being that there was a time, and many places there still is that time, where virtual power plants are mostly just solar panels, rooftop solar panels, and customer-owned storage, or in some places only smart thermostats that are controlled by the utility. But now a virtual power plant can be an aggregation of many different things: smart water heaters, smart uh, uh, heaters for homes, all kinds of things, right?
EV charging systems, yeah.
Early charging, that's right. Yeah.
Yeah, which is so exciting, yeah, that you can take all of these technologies and then, aggregate them together.
This episode is brought to you by the Policy Resolution Group at Bracewell, where law, policy, and strategic communications intersect to help clients navigate what's next. At Bracewell, we know energy. It's the industry we serve, the power behind big ideas, and the force we bring to every challenge. For nearly 80 years, our firm has helped industry leaders tackle high-stakes challenges with creativity, precision, and results. Bracewell's DC-based Policy Resolution Group helps clients anticipate what's coming so they can shape what's possible, from chaos to clarity. Learn more at bracewell.com/PRG.
Right. And that's what you mentioned, utility-led versus other kinds of programs. Sometimes the states want the utility to control the virtual power plant. Sometimes they allow independent aggregators to bring a whole group of customers in. Um, and so it's a different kind of a participation where the utility works with an independent provider. But now that we've defined that and your great summary of what's going on, I want to get back to what you're talking about with GITS. Part of that is GETS is grid enhancing technologies, as you mentioned, and there are ways to get more from a transmission line or a transmission system without necessarily rebuilding it from scratch, right?
Yeah, exactly. What can we do to expand the capacity of that line without building completely new lines, which obviously very expensive and takes a very long time to do.
Right. And I wanted to mention that that's a way of addressing all this discussion of data center demand because
Mhm.
you can bring more power to those data centers without having to build new transmission. Although I do want to mention, I did some reporting on that, and there's a lot of concern about some of the executive orders interfering with the ability of the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission to to support the distribution of grid enhancing technologies.
Yeah, and as we talked about the levels of authority, transmission is one area where the federal government does have more authority in that, particularly in certain regions.
Exactly, and one of the things that's mentioned in the NCCETC update for Q1 2025 is the regional system for the West, the Mountain West, has been approved by the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, And that's a big deal because it supports the reliability of many of the utilities throughout the Mountain West, right?
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And in a region where they haven't historically had a wholesale market at all. So this is a significant new development.
Now, I want to ask one more before we move on to the last question. One more thing from the Q1 2025 policy update. And of course, I encourage our listeners to check this out because it's so full of information about the diversity of activities across the country. You lived in Maine. Have you been following this debate about the distribution system operator? Because that impacts the discussion about virtual power plants. It's more directed at customers and the resources that they can own, right?
Yeah, yeah, it would they were looking at the feasibility of, setting up a distribution system operator, kind of an independent entity to manage distributed systems and the distribution system. Um, and I think their study found that, such an operator could reduce costs, enhance performance, and accelerate their climate goals. But it would basically be a lot of work, a lot of investment, a lot of coordination. And they found that, maybe there are some alternative pathways to get to the same solution. So they're not planning to pursue the development of a distribution system operator at this time. And that
Now,
was
this
actually
is
the first, I think, state to really look at that concept.
Yeah, exactly. That's what I was gonna say. This is an idea that's been floating around for a long time. And for our listeners, it's really important. You to get the most out of customer-owned resources, you want to be able to bring them together and serve the power system. It's not just a matter of putting energy in, it's also sometimes turning your energy down. Sometimes it's even using some of these devices that customers own to guard the system against what are called voltage or frequency fluctuations. It's very technical stuff. And if the utility doesn't have some way to protect their voltage and their frequency, never mind what that is specifically, they have to build new infrastructure, right?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So
Sorry about that.
it's a very complex process. There's a lot going on. And so it does make some sense for there to be, an entity managing all of these distributed devices.
Right. And but the question is it does it need to be an independent entity that aggregates all the aggregators and the utilities resources, or does it can the utility do it? And that's where the debate is. And it's really I don't know how to express without seeming a little too wonky how important it is that a state actually took this on.
Mm, yeah, it is very exciting. It's very unique, and it does bring back kind of the age-old debate about utility ownership and utility, control of this, and whether it's, optimal, whether it's necessary, and what the best path is for each state.
It also brings on the familiar debate about how best to control these resources. And that brings me to my last question. We don't have a lot of time left, Autumn, but I really do want to get to this question. Um, Grid modernization is going to cost money. It's going to cost customers money. They're going to have to add to their bills if they want a modern system. And the advantage of having a modern system, you've talked about it several times, resiliency, reliability, uh, getting more for customer-owned resources. But are regulators willing to spend? Have they shown an inclination to be willing to allow utilities and system operators to spend the money and then charge it to customers? They
Mm.
talk about distributed energy resource management systems, DERMS. Are they approving investments in DERMS?
So it's a mix, I think, that we've been seeing in terms of decisions. Largely, I think regulators have been approving a lot of these investments, and in grid modernization investments in general have seen a lot of approvals. I think part of that may be that increasingly we're also seeing utilities take maybe a bit more of a phased approach, an incremental approach to the investments that they're making, rather than so many of these really massive plans with tons of investments all at once. And I think some of that might come from these state requirements requiring utilities to file distribution system plans. So they've got kind of this routine process. So they're expected, they've got to evaluate it and incrementally can propose these new investments. So definitely are seeing increasingly DERMs showing up in these plans and investment proposals. And I think a lot of utilities are moving, they've got AMI, they've got some of these more traditional distribution automation technologies, and are now like looking at the next technological steps that they can take. And DERMs are right up there, along with things like advanced distribution management systems.
Yeah, exactly. And so that really brings together the whole conversation that we've had today, because it having better control of the distribution system with these DERMs allows utilities to more effectively meet these data center loads that they're seeing for the first time, and it allows them to bring customer-owned resources into the system to meet those loads without having to build new power plants and new infrastructure. So it's all coming together, and that's what I think of when I think of grid modernization, is integrating all of the system resources at the lowest cost. Um, that's all the time we have, Autumn. It's been great having you on the podcast again. And as always, you've just given us this really voluminous view of what's happening in the U.S. power system. My guest has been Autumn Proudlove, Managing Director for Policy and Markets with the North Carolina Clean Energy Technology Center at North Carolina State University. She's given us wonderful insights into the newest trends in legislative and regulatory policy targeting grid modernization to repair the U.S. power system to integrate the full array of system resources. I also want to thank our listeners and our sponsor, Bracewell LLP. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and share with everybody you know the USEA Power Sector Podcast's quest for energy transition solutions.